All right, hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're sitting down with a brand new guest. Her name is Maria Francesca French. We're going to talk about her brand new book, Safer Than the Known Way. And so, Maria, welcome to the show. I love what you're doing, and I'm excited to connect with you.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be here.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward.
definitely. Yeah, for sure. So, like I said, I loved your book, and I think I mentioned it to you in maybe our Instagram chatting or in
Yeah.
email, something like that. But your your spiritual journey, although it's very different, obviously has a lot of parallels to my own. And so the language you're using about so many things like sucked me right in. I found myself going, yes, yes, like someone who understands what's going on in my
Mm.
brain. So I was thinking that maybe we could begin there. Obviously, first tell us a little bit about yourself, basic stuff. Who are you? What do you do? That kind of thing. But then maybe take us into your spiritual journey a little bit, like where you were, where you are, what got you from A to B. Then we'll go down some rabbit holes and see where we end up.
Yeah. Lots of rabbit holes to choose also,
Yes.
as per my book. And I actually mentioned that a few times. Hey, if you're reading this right now, and if you feel like you've fallen down the rabbit hole in Alice's Wonderland, you're reading it right. So
That's
okay,
right.
good. So it's perfect metaphor, Glenn. Thank you.
Yeah.
So a little bit about me. Essentially, I guess I can't really separate myself from my story. So maybe I should start with the second part of that question, which was the faith journey piece. But essentially, these days, I sort of call myself a post-Christian thinker and writer because it
Mhm.
is what I do. Everything I do along the lines of writing and publishing and coaching and pathos writing and Patreon stuff, everything is in this field of post-Christianity, or some people like to call it post-theism,
Mhm.
post-God, very different from atheism, different from traditional theism, and still engaging well and deeply
Mhm.
Christianity, but just from a different orientation and from a different direction. And our gaze is diverted to different goals, different
Mhm.
values. In terms of my story and sort of my faith transitions and my faith narrative, it's not an uncommon one. I grew up in New York, Italian Catholic community. So, on Long Island, when you were Italian, you were Roman Catholic. It was just who you were. We were very, culturally embedded in that sort of
Mhm.
heritage, and it was who you are, and it's the community that held you. And I remember going into Catholic churches as a little girl, whether it was a small parish church or a cathedral or basilica somewhere. And I just always remember walking in with just this immense feeling of curiosity. You'd
Mhm.
walk in and you could hear people whispering because you're supposed to be quiet in these churches, and so quiet where you could kind of hear someone's heels kind of walking down the hallway. You'd, maybe hear those kneelers kind of slam against the floor. You'd hear the closing door of the confessional. You'd hear sort of the metallic tangling of the incense. Just, it was such a, like, really a sensory experience for me. But I
Mhm.
always remember walking in and just having a very real sense that there was something in here that was bigger and better than me, and it was holy, and people called it God, and I'm here and
Mhm.
I'm a part of it. And it was like, oh, you just kind of look up, and just this kind of weird reverence, I guess, as a
Mhm.
child. And by the time I made all of my sacraments in the Catholic Church. And then by the time I was about 12, 13, my mom moved my sister and I to a very large evangelical charismatic church on Long Island. And this is where the not uncommon part comes in. I grew up like a lot of young evangelicals in youth group culture, getting saved, having that altar experience, Jesus living in your heart, God
Mhm.
has a will for your life. If you're that age, you're probably getting wrapped up in purity culture and true love waits campaigns
Yeah.
and missions trips. And if you're in public school, you're trying to do Bible club stuff, and everything was about
Evangelize, right?
evangelizing, yeah,
Yeah.
and telling people about Jesus. And then I was just totally fully engaged in my Christianity, that
Mhm.
part of my life. And then by the time I made it to university when I was 18, I was fully immersed in a Pentecostal tradition. I moved to the Midwest in the US. I went
Mhm.
to an Assembly of God school, even more ministry, like everything you could think of, fully engaging spiritual gifts, speaking in tongues, like prayer all day, every day, like worship services, all of that.
No.
And then, eventually I moved onto seminary. I kind of left a lot of the charismatic stuff behind me. Little by little, you shed a little bit of that.
Mhm.
And then I very, quickly became progressive evangelical and then post evangelical. And now I find myself in this space of post Christianity. And so it's been really interesting because it has been so much, I'm essentially a week away from my 40th birthday. Essentially, it's been 40 years of this ever, depending on how you want to look at it, raveling or unraveling of this Christian narrative that I've been in. But yeah, that's my story in a nutshell. And I go into it a little bit more in depth in the first chapter of my book,
Mhm.
because I want people to, well, one, I want people to know sort of where I'm coming from and the place from which I write all of this stuff about post-Christianity and present some of these ideas and invite people into the space. But
Yeah.
also because I think people will see themselves somewhere in my story trajectory, and they'll be able to place their own narrative and their own experience, kind of like you when you read it
Yes.
in there.
Yeah,
So yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. It's you've been in like involved in so many different worlds of
Yeah.
Christianity, like so many different places on the spectrum that you've
Hmm.
experienced, and so I think a
Hmm.
lot of that comes through in your book. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, for our listeners especially, what this idea of post God and post Christian means, because I feel like that terminology was new, honestly, for me coming into your book. I feel like it's probably new for a lot of listeners as well, because in the book you have this quote, and I have it here. Here it is. While we are post God, we're not post faith. And this is what
Mm.
it means to be post Christian. So these
Yes.
things that are now post for you,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean, I think, that you've left all of it behind, right? And
Right.
correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not like you're saying you've left God, like if you've gone full Richard Dawkins, or you've left Christianity, or you've left anything really, but it means that you've evolved in some way. So maybe just take us
Yeah.
into that terminology a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, for me, like if I was in the Richard Dawkins, et al. Camp, the
Hmm.
whole new atheist anti-God squad. I mean, for me, that I would just call a spade a spade. I would just be an atheist, but I'm
Right.
very much not an atheist because I don't buy and trade in those currencies of existence and ontology and being an object and, all of those
Yeah.
concepts anymore. For me,
You get
those
accused of it though, don't you?
I do all the time. And I talk about it in my book, anything from like unorthodox to heretic to atheist to, wolf in sheep's clothing. It's all there. But nobody gets to define me or my relationship to
Yeah,
Christianity. And
yeah.
and that's true for everyone. Nobody gets to define anyone's relationship to God, to Christianity, faith, all of those things. For me, post-Christianity, well, a couple of things.
Mhm,
And I talk a little bit about language in my book and how important language is, but also
mhm,
how it just can't possibly keep up with our changing experiences of being human. And not only with being human, but like with engaging faith and,
mhm,
things that we claim are, unseen realities and things that we can feel and intuit and imagine and sense,
mhm.
if you know what I mean. In a sense, the immaterial. And so how do you ask language to hold that
Mhm,
in any, real way? So
mhm,
language is always our best attempt, but our lives usually move too fast for the trajectory of language and how fast, new metaphors can be put out there to represent some of this stuff.
mhm,
So in that sense, post anything is simply because we are right after what has just happened.
mhm,
And we can't quite find new language for it yet. And I talk about that in the later chapters. What's the deal with this term post?
mhm,
What's the deal with post and post-Christian? And then what's the deal with Christian and post-Christian? Why are these
mhm,
concepts so important to put together? But essentially, I haven't left Christianity as you sort of just
mhm,
imagined or guessed. I've simply diverted my gaze in a different direction, and
mhm,
I've changed my orientation to it. And so traditional theism, traditional notions of God, traditional ideas and understandings of how we engage God. Yes,
mhm,
that is behind me. And now I am asking new questions of how we engage that stuff for the 21st
mhm,
century in ways that foster real and deep and ongoing transformation, both individually and communally. And the question of transformation is not a new one. It's certainly not unique to me and to post-Christianity, but usually when you're asking it in faith contexts or church contexts, people are asking it and giving very old, at best 20th century answers
mhm.
to those questions. So we're trying to go past all of that and at the same time get off that sliding scale spectrum of theism versus atheism, right? Because essentially we're just talking about a particular construct of God, an
Mhm,
interventionist one, a personal one, the one who lives in our hearts, the one who has agency and being and lives in the sky, if you will.
mhm.
And being post-Christian is about hopping that track, that ping pong match that keeps us back and forth between these debates that often sound like, a dog chasing its tail, and you just, you can never
Round and
win. So
around. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So when you talk about like these new questions, these new ways of defining God, like, can you give us an example of what the new questions are that you're asking? Because I know, like, a lot of our listeners are coming from that evangelical world where it's, you know it very well. It's just like how you think
Mhm.
about God is just a very narrow way. So I think a lot of
Yeah.
people who tune into this podcast are trying to expand that a little bit and wonder
Mhm.
what if there are ways of thinking about God that are different than what
Yeah.
this tradition has given us. So for you, like, what kind of questions are you asking these days about God?
I think that this pop culture word of deconstruction and this language that a whole demographic and psychographic of
Hmm.
people are using to describe their process for disentwining, disentangling,
Hmm.
dismantling toxic forms of religion that are controlling and manipulative and fear-based. I think those are some of the right conversations to be having,
Hmm.
and the right kind of questions to sort of be, I guess, interrogating the current
Hmm.
God that sits on high, if you will.
Yep.
But the new questions that we need to be asking, are not questions of the God that sits on high with the big G in the sky, but the little G God that instead of goes high goes low, and
Hmm.
instead of is strong is weak, and
Hmm.
sort of, in true radical theology fashion, gets deep down into the roots of, what is the point of the theological task in the first place?
Hmm.
The search and the journey of all of that is theological in and of itself, even if it doesn't have a particular destination. And not to say that it doesn't,
Hmm.
but destination isn't the point in this conversation. So we can ask questions, but the point is to ask the question, right? And not
Yeah.
necessarily to have it answered. And the point is to expand our imaginations as far as we can when it
Hmm.
comes to any imagination for God and faith, and then going to the bounds of that imagination and then trying to go even further. Because I think I just mentioned the current deconstruction conversation.
Hmm.
And, you see this, I just mentioned also the binary between theism and atheism. We see this with conservative and liberal Christianity as well, this binary. On the conservative side of things, you have a very wrathful, vengeful,
Hmm.
judgy God who, either you need to accept this God as personal savior or you go to hell. And, it's
I
all of
get
that,
it. Right.
right? This
Yeah.
mean, this mean, unsympathetic, unempathetic God. And then on the other side, you have this really kind God, you have a
Hmm.
loving God, you have an all-inclusive God who invites everyone to the table, who's feminist and womanist and anti-racist and pro LGBTQ and for reproductive rights. And so you have this much more kinder God, but it's still the same construct of God. So perhaps the imagination expanded a little bit, but it didn't expand enough because we're still dealing with, you know, again, the God on high. It's just a nicer one. And it's still a
Yeah.
God made in our own image. And I talk a little bit about that in the book, that
Yep.
even though we're ascribing more amiable qualities to this more liberal and progressive God, it's still dangerous when we make a God who looks like us, no matter how noble the
Yeah.
attribute.
Yeah. That's really good. You mentioned about how it's about asking questions without necessarily needing to have the answers. Would you say
Yeah.
that is that at the heart of what deconstruction really is? Because I feel like you said, like, deconstruction is such a buzzword these days. I
Yeah.
feel like everybody's using it. And now that you have a lot of the conservative pastors who are out there on Twitter and stuff, like, shaming deconstruction people, and you have the deconstruction people like really pushing back on it. But I feel like the heart of what deconstruction is getting lost in the mix of everything, because I feel like nobody really understands what it is, but everybody's using the word. So would you say that, like, deconstruction at the heart of it, at least part of it, is being willing to ask the questions, but then being able to sit with the ambiguity of not necessarily knowing the answer?
Yeah, I think that's a really big part of it. And I think that's really hard for people.
Hmm.
I think just human nature
Especially coming
in
out of
general.
that world where you need to have answers,
Especially,
right?
yes, yeah. And so we still want those answers. We just want better ones. Like I said, we
Yeah.
just want nicer ones. We just want bigger ones.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the switching around of language. So instead of saying God, now maybe we say universe, or we say love, or
Yeah.
just bigger concepts. But it's still like a life force. There's still something that is moving, that we can very clearly define,
Right.
and still has very similar attributes to an interventionist God in terms of being omnipresent and omniscient and all powerful. And you say the right words. If you there's a lot of rhetoric around manifestation these days. And all of that, you say the right words, you act the right way, and the universe will reward you by sort of giving back to you whatever, and I'm not indicting this. I'm not judging it at all. I'm just saying that we have to be very careful, because we are ascribing very similar qualities to these bigger entities. And sometimes it can be a little deceptive. When it comes to deconstruction and this whole movement and this whole term, back when I kind of did the whole evangelical youth group thing in the 90s, and in the early 2000s, if you had questions, if you were wondering about stuff, there was this term deconstruction was not around. Like you were backsliding, or
Going
there were other
astray, the prodigal, right?
Yeah, the prodigal, exactly. But for me, like, retrospectively speaking, I think when I moved through some of those faith transitions, I look back and said, yeah, no, that was a faith transition, as opposed to calling it deconstruction or something like that. But I've been sitting back like the last 2 years, and I've been involved in the conversation. It's not like I've sat silent, but I've sat back and really wanted to watch and listen, because, people want to be heard right now. People are really hurt, and they're really angry. And for really good reason. A lot of people have been mistreated and used and abused by church and its hierarchy and its ideology and its doctrine, and now they're raging against it. There's loss, there's grief. People are really mad because their identities are being blown to bits. Your whole life, you've staked your entire spiritual narrative and story into this particular story of God, what people have been peddling as God. And now that doesn't exist for you anymore the way that it did. And now who are you outside of that? And people are having to not only rethink their gods, but rethink themselves. But for me, as someone who's done, a lot of work in continental philosophy and philosophical hermeneutics, and, I've been around this word deconstruction, which is essentially a term that has been applied to literature and that has subverted French structuralism, and, was purported by Martin Heidegger, and then, really kind of brought to the fore with Jacques Derrida, and then, further expounded upon and theologically appropriated by Mark Taylor and John Caputo, and is now being used in radical theology a lot. So as I'm hearing the last few years, people talk about deconstruction in this way, I'm like, well, how did they get this word? And, how are they using it in this way? And that was actually part of the reason why I wanted to write the book, because, actual deconstruction is really powerful and requires a lot of bravery and a lot of courage. And in a sense, it does require us stepping out into the darkness that I would argue in my book, of course, is safer than the known way. It's safer than being a part of all that is known. It's actually better to go out into this abyss of, chaos and darkness than to stay in the certainty and the comfort of what we were. But I did want to bring Derridian deconstruction to a pop culture level in my book, because I think that there's so much hope, and there's so much invitation, and there's so much freedom, and there's so much excitement and inspiration and imagination, and like beyond the sky is the limit with the kind of deconstruction that I talk about in the book, which is not mine. I'm essentially translating some concepts that usually stay pretty well housed in ivory tower academic situations into hopefully the hands of pop culture, where it can really be useful and hopefully very transformative and meaningful.
Yeah. It's funny because I'm so exhausted from all of the debating.
Yeah.
You and I talked about how you said you've put like debating kind of on the side, and I've done the same. Like, I feel like it's just, the debating and like looking for answers is exhausting. Like, I feel like all I ever did growing up in, the evangelical private Christian school from the 4th through 12th grades, I was reading like Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict when I was in the 10th
Yes.
grade. I was like
Yes.
obsessed with
Yeah.
answers and having
Yeah.
been able to defend my faith. And then,
Same.
yeah, when I got to college, seminary was the same kind of thing. And then when I began to like deconstruct and ask
Mm,
questions, but I brought that same mentality with me to the other side. Like I
yeah.
still needed to have the answers. Because I can
Mhm.
remember sitting here at my desk with my feeling like my faith was falling apart, like having questions
Yeah.
about hell and the atonement. And like, what do I
Yeah.
do with this verse? What about this verse? What about this verse? And
Mm.
going on Twitter and finding like people like Brian McLaren and just asking them
Yes.
questions like, I'm not trying to be annoying. Can you please just answer me this question? What do I do with John 3:16 or whatever if this is not true? And he was so patient and kind in answering my
Mm,
questions. And then when I actually got to talk to him, he said to me, like, there's gonna come a time when you're gonna get tired of trying to look for all the answers to the question.
yeah.
You're gonna get just comfortable with sitting in the mystery of it all. And I was like, that's never gonna come from me because I always have to have answers. But now I feel like I'm in this place where I'm like, I get that because there's so many times people ask me, well, what do you think about the atonement? Or what do you think about this or that? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. All I know is there's something that's much bigger than myself.
Mhm.
Somehow I fit into the puzzle, and I'm just grateful for every breath I get to take, and that's it. And that's kind of where I am with my life right now. Like I don't have the
Yeah.
answers that I thought I needed, and somehow I feel like that's
Mm.
okay.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you talk about mystery because essentially, you're talking about this concept, this little word of perhaps,
Yes.
which we also get from Derrida, and I talk a little bit about that in my book as well. And it's
Mhm.
this caveat, it's this kind of this innate thing that is somehow present in all of all things. It's this like weird self-destruct button where everything can be going according to plan. And then all of a sudden there's a little hiccup that changes everything for
Right.
everyone, everywhere. And perhaps, that might happen. Like, maybe this will go along the way it's supposed to, interconnected to all of these things. And we have our understanding and it performs exactly the way it's supposed to. But perhaps it
Mm,
might be disrupted and interrupted by something that we simply cannot predict and have no precedent for and have no mold for, that breaks the mold,
yeah.
and that just shatters, you know, all of our knowledge bases, any epistemology we might have had up until this point. This is this idea of perhaps, and this is actually true deconstruction.
Mm,
And it's really exciting and it's really powerful because it takes all the pressure off of us
hmm.
to have to know. And that doesn't mean we just walk around being like, oh, we don't know anything, so don't expect anything from us.
Right. Yeah.
But in the matters that we're talking about right now, um, coming to the table and just being open
Yeah.
to all of life and
Yeah.
anything that might come for us in relationship to the story that we've already been writing. And so, I had someone ask me recently, I was teaching online and then I took some questions and someone asked me, well, how does this apply to people who are Hindu or Muslim or Jewish or Baha'i, or, they named all of these different faiths. And I said, well, I don't, really, I'm working within the bounds of the meta narrative of Christianity and the New
Hmm.
Testament, and all of the radical imperatives that we see coming to us via the Gospels of Jesus Christ. So,
Hmm.
if people were asking me how to be post their own, if someone
Hmm.
wanted to be post Islam or something like this, do it. But that they need to figure out their own relationship and what it means for them to be post their own religious tradition.
Yeah.
If we're just gonna be anything out in the world, then we can divorce ourselves from Christianity and we
Yeah.
can say Jesus doesn't matter and it's not worth talking about, or, it's just all garbage because we can't, trust this historical document and that's all this is anyway. So, but if we actually still really care about what it means to associate with Jesus, if we actually still care what it means to continue to engage our Christianity, even though we're past it, then that's the post-Christian conversation. And that's the one I'm trying to have. And I think it's one that a lot of people are interested in. So,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
really good. Is it possible, like, talking about like post-Christian, post-God, in the mix of all of that, I feel like I'm in this place where I'm like post-Bible as well,
Mm,
right?
mhm.
Like I feel like
Yeah.
because I still read my Bible. I get accused of never reading my Bible. That's what people say. You must never read your Bible. But I read my
You
Bible all
clearly
the
don't know
time,
what it says, Glenn, so you must
right?
never read it.
You moron, right? But I read it like a couple of times a week. I open it up and I read
Yeah.
something. I'm reading through the Gospel of Mark right now,
Okay.
and I'm realizing that I used to bring a whole different set of questions to the text.
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
10 years ago, I would sit down with my Bible every morning with my journal, and I would ask the question of like, what does this mean for my life? What does this mean for the church? What does this mean for my theology, the way that I think about God? What is this telling me about God? But now the question I bring is, this is so interesting. Like, why is this story still around? Like
Yeah.
Jesus spitting in some guy's eye. Why is that like been around for 2000 years? Like why is that particular story, has that stood the test of time for so long, that it
Mm.
meant so much to people for all of these years? Like what does that mean? And I feel like that brings up a whole different set of questions that doesn't really bring any definitive answer, but I
Hmm.
feel like it expands my imagination so much
Yeah.
of what God could be, who Jesus could be, and what
Yeah.
my place in the midst of all of this could be. So the Bible, very much still important to me, but I
Yeah.
would define myself as post-Bible in a way that I don't think about it anymore the way that I used to. Is that
Sure.
am I using the terminology correctly?
Oh gosh. I
Maybe.
guess that's not really for me to decide. That's for you, I suppose.
Yeah.
Post-Bible isn't something, isn't a term I've used. That's really interesting though, because in the same way there are these debates on this sliding scale of, atheism and theism and conservative Christian versus liberal Christian. I also think there's this spectrum of, the inerrant and infallible,
Yeah.
word of God.
Yep.
And it's just a historical document filled with errors and historical slip-ups and factual no-shows and, all of these
All
things.
the
And
things.
so, how do we still honor the text
Right.
and
Right.
at the
Right.
same time understanding that it was written beautifully by human hands having a human experience in their
Yeah.
particular socio-historical time uh line or whatever. And I think that is how we honor scripture, and that is
Right.
how, like, this obviously matters to us. Again, like, we're not atheists, right? We're post-theists, so we're post a particular construct of God. This doesn't mean, like you quoted what I said earlier, this doesn't mean we're post-faith. It doesn't have to mean we're post-Jesus or
Yeah.
post-caring about any of this stuff. It just means we've orientated ourselves differently to it all and to the story.
Yeah.
So when we're dealing with the text, you said you don't bring yourself to it the way you used to, and I think
Mhm.
that's good because you know we bring a load of presuppositions to the
Mhm.
text. That's essentially our own baggage. What our pastor might have told us in Sunday school, what our parents told us growing up, some book we
Mhm.
read by some guy saying he thinks he knows what's happening in Mark, or
Right.
whatever. So and then our own experience with the text, reading our
Mhm.
own selves into it, as opposed to sort of like coming up to it and like peering in and saying, okay, like, I need to tread with some sense of hermeneutical humility and theological humility because I just don't know. And like, this text, to at least, the New Testament, this is 2000 years old. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? It was written in a time and place where I will never understand and I will never know, but I have these tools that I can use to employ, and I'm going to do my best to honor the text. And a good way of honoring the text is allowing the text to construct something for us,
Yeah.
rather than us saying like, oh, well, because my pastor said this, and John 3:16, like that must mean this, because
Right.
like, why, just asking the question, like, what is this only begotten son language? Why is it important for John to talk about Jesus as God's son? What is happening there?
Yeah.
Is there referentiality within the text? Does this mean something more than just like the kid of God? Like,
Yeah.
do you know what I mean? And just following those curiosities, I think we honor the text. So I
That's
mean,
so
there's
good.
lots of different
Yeah.
ways to engage the Bible as someone who's post Christian, post some of this
Yeah.
stuff.
No, it's really good. All right, you have a word in your book called hauntology. And
Yes.
I did a blog post using that word a while ago, and I sort of molded the word to fit a different kind of idea that I was trying to work with at the time, because I'm like, oh, that's a
Yeah.
great word. And I read about it. I'm like, but I'm not using it like that. I'm using it for something different. So I made it evident in the blog post that I wasn't using it in the way that the word was meant to be used. But you use it in your book in the way that it's meant to be used. And I was wondering if you could take us into what this word means a little bit, because I think it's really interesting. I think it's going to help a lot of our listeners process some things.
Yeah. Well, essentially, it's a term taken from Marxism, from Karl Marx. Um, and it was called out by Derrida, who talked a lot about haunting and hauntology, and
Mhm.
then again appropriated by theologians and philosophers like
Mhm.
Mark C. Taylor and John Caputo,
Mhm.
working out of a radical theology tradition and trajectory. But essentially, it's the sense that we're haunted. We're haunted by ghosts from the past, from the present, and actually the future. And John Caputo says something really meaningful about this haunting and taunting and teasing and these whispers.
Mhm.
And he basically says, once you've been disrupted by this kind of haunting and this kind of ghost, you can try and go back. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. You
Yeah.
can try and go back to normal everyday life. You can try and pretend like you've never heard it. But
Yeah.
the truth is, if you try to pretend that you can just go back to business as usual, you will fall into utter despair, because
Mhm.
once you've been haunted, you cannot undo that reality. Your
That's right.
reality is changed forever. And so we have to sort of listen to these voices of these ghosts that are coming at us from really everywhere, both the past and the present. And with this idea of haunting, it's really interesting, because when we think about ghosts, when you imagine yourself being spooked by something, it's just the tiniest little discomfort, right?
Yeah.
At first, it's just like the little prick of the spindle. It's in the Princess and the Pea. She's on 100 mattresses and she feels the pea at the
Yeah.
bottom. Like, do you know what I mean? It's this tiny little tear
Yeah. Something's not
in
right. Yeah.
your world as you know it. But it's like that pebble in your shoe. Like, you're this big human and it's this tiny little pebble under your foot, but you just can't deny
Yeah.
that this has agitated in a way that you just can't go back to the way it was before. And it's amazing, because again, it comes from this place of, you could almost call it a still small voice. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? It's
Yeah.
not this raging sea. It's not some, warrior coming at you, with, weaponry and, you know, bombastic, like, shouting. And
Yeah.
it's nothing that's in your face, and it's
Mhm.
nothing that is going to force itself on you.
Yeah.
It's simply a matter of really being disrupted and never being the same again.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that for me is so huge, because like that idea of not being able to go back, because I was thinking of it
Mhm.
like that's the Christmas Carol story, like
Yeah.
once you're visited by the ghost of Christmas
Yes.
past, present, future, like once you wake up from this dream or whatever it is of
Mhm.
encountering these ghosts, like you can't possibly go back to the way things were. Like for Scrooge
Yeah.
to go back to the way he was before he went to sleep, like that's I would ruin the story, but it's like unthinkable for him to be able to do that.
Unthinkable.
Yeah, and so,
Yeah.
like, once you get a peek of the context of the past, like, how you
Mhm.
got to the present, the hope of maybe what could be in the future, like, you can't possibly go back, and I often think to myself, like, maybe it would be easier for me to go back to being
Mm.
the good evangelical soldier that I was. Like, at least I had a lot of friends. I felt like I had a lot of answers. Everything felt pretty good. Like,
Yeah.
I was gonna be pastor at church, and, there's medical benefits that makes life a lot easier. You get a house in the package with your salary that makes things
Yeah.
easier. But like now I think like for me to go back to that, like I feel like Scrooge, like I can't possibly go back to the way I was
Mm.
before
Mhm.
I fell asleep. But falling asleep, I feel like I really woke up, you know what I mean? So I feel like I
Mhm.
can't possibly go
Mhm.
back to the way things were. But I think
Yeah.
that idea of hauntology and these visited by these ghosts, like it's such
Yeah.
a perfect description of this process of deconstruction, because we've
Yeah.
seen things that we can't unsee and you can't
Yeah.
go back.
Yeah. And it's funny. So, like, back when I first started seminary and
Mhm.
my eyes were being opened from, like, evangelical Pentecostal girl who simply read her Bible for devotional purposes
Mhm.
and learned how to maybe preach a topical 3-point sermon or whatever, to being introduced to scholars like Tom Wright, for
Mm,
instance,
yeah.
who, was and is in a lot of ways still a Colossus, but, the late 90s, early 2000s really was his, heyday. Anyway,
His
I don't want to get
wheelhouse.
myself in trouble with saying things that, but he had all of those big academic volumes, at the time, but
Mhm.
then he started writing stuff for pop culture that was more accessible and more, consumable. And
Mhm.
he had this book out, and I talk about it, I think, in one of the early chapters of my book, called Simply Christian. And the whole
Yeah.
book was about why Christianity made sense. And in the beginning, he talks about what he calls echoes of a voice.
Mm.
And he says, you'll be walking along in life and you hear a whisper and you turn around really fast. And, you have like almost this whiplash moment of, like, you can see, like, kind of the light ray or whatever, something scurrying. You can't make it out. You can, basically just see its shadow run around the corner, and you can't even hear the whisper anymore. It's gone. The moment you heard it, it's gone. And he, this is what it's like living as a human and being a Christian in the world. Like, we're constantly hearing like voices and invitations of new ways to be in the world in which we live, and kind of that already not yet sense.
Yeah.
And I remember reading this for the first time. I don't know, it was probably like maybe 2006. And I was like, yes, oh my God, this is so it. And then as time went on for me, and I started, dabbling in radical theology, and then hearing this language of haunting and whispers. And, Derrida talks about this French concept of l'avenir, which is this idea of something coming to us from the future. But then leaving again as soon as it's arrived, and then coming back again, but then going, and it's kind of all of this crazy stuff happening at the same time. I was just like, oh yeah, okay. Like, this has been like the lifelong pursuit, really, of these whispers and these echoes of this voice, and I'm still pursuing it.
Yeah.
It's just like I said, once you've been awakened to some of these new realities and these new ways of seeing the world and engaging God. I mean, you could go back to the way it was before, but you can't really.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like it also, that word is also so good, because haunting, it's like you have this sense that there's something going on around you that you can't quite put your finger on what it is. You can't quite see it, but like, something's there. And I feel like that's the way it is with this process, right? Because like you have this sense that something's going on. I don't know what it is that's going on, but something's unearthing inside of me. It's doing something to my life. It's doing something to my history, do something to my future. And you can't put a name on it. You can't give it an answer. You can't, outline it, blueprint it. Like, it's just, it's there, but it's very foggy at best. But yet, for certain that something's going on. I feel like it's a perfect term in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, it has all of these language partners. So you have the haunting piece, then you have deconstruction, then you have perhaps, then you have, l'avenir. Speaking of l'avenir, another French philosopher and theologian, Jean-Paul Martinon, he says that l'avenir signals that something is afoot, that there is movement happening, even though you don't know the direction from which it comes and goes. And the moment you feel something flash past you and you turn around, it's gone, but it's already in another, it's that sense that it unhinges and it just disjoints. And so placing ourselves firmly, on a plane of, the existence of a particular kind of God construct, where we know everything there is to know. We have all of these, doctrinal and ideological understanding. Systematic theology, and in a sense, confessional theology, really. Because that's what radical theology subverts, is confessional theology, and, where we think we know God is actually unknowable. And where we have contained God is actually uncontainable. And where we have named God is actually unnameable. And so, it's that apophatic tradition, a negative way of speaking about things. Actually, John Caputo calls it wounded language, kind of circling back to the beginning of our conversation where I talked about how language just isn't hardly good enough for the task that it's really been charged with, and the task that it's been given. It's wounded, and it does the best that it can. And that's even a better reason, another reason why we should hold this stuff fairly loosely, because it is all being housed in language which is broken. And it's our best attempt, really.
That's right. I think it's important for our listeners to hear too, is this conversation has been going on for a long time. Like, this is not new. The words might be becoming popular again, but it's not new. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people who are in this world are getting accused of, is like, this is some new fad. One pastor said it's like the sexy thing to do. Mark Driscoll's been on Twitter lately doing a lot of different things about people deconstructing, but it's like they're making it seem like this is some new fad that's happening, but it's not new. This is a path, so to speak, that's been going on for a long time, that we're just stepping into and taking part in, and it's evolving and it's growing and it's changing, but it's not like it's new. Maria French did not invent the process.
No, I definitely didn't. Not at all. It's not new,
Yeah.
and the language is not new.
Hmm.
Maybe how it's being used in pop culture
Correct.
is a little bit new,
Yeah.
but these cycles of like, you always in every generation you have a group of Christians and a group of evangelicals, or we can say all of Christians. We don't have to limit it to just evangelicals.
Hmm.
But it's essentially a whole generation of people saying, what the
Yeah.
you know
Right.
is going on here,
Yeah.
and we're not standing for this anymore, and things need to change.
Yeah.
So it is that cycle, but instead of keeping that cycle going,
Yeah.
again, essentially what I'm asking, and I think what post Christianity is asking, is to hop that cycle, to
Yeah.
hop that circle. And I talk about the language of circles and no more circles and all of that
Yeah.
early in the book. But what if we hop that track and ask other questions that let us forward and just
That's
off
right.
of that cycle,
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
So
All right. Last question for you.
yeah.
Talk to the person listening. If they're on the mic today, kind of expressing their fear of jumping over that line. They're feeling that
Mm,
the safest place for them is the place with the answers because that's all they've ever known. But your book is positioning that there is a safer than the known way. There is this other way, and they're hesitant to kind of throw themselves out there. What advice would you give them in the midst of that fear, that anxiety that they're feeling? They have pressure from their families, they have pressure from their friends, their church groups, all the
mhm,
different things that you and I and many people have experienced. What would
mhm.
be your advice to that person today?
Well, gosh, my knee-jerk reaction to that question is time.
Hmm.
To just give yourself time, because I think one of the pitfalls of the current deconstruction conversation, again, one that I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for, and one that
Hmm.
I have a lot of time for,
Yeah.
because I understand how awful like the church has been to some of these people. But I think the temptation is to say, okay, we're totally done with this. Now we want this. And
Yes. Yes.
there's a
Yes.
lot of talk now of this term reconstruction. Like, how do you
Oh,
deconstruct
yes.
and how do you reconstruct?
That's a
I,
whole
I
nother
just, yeah,
podcast.
exactly. I just don't think I don't think that's the most appropriate response. Because
I wish I could hit an applause button right now because I
yeah,
would have clapping.
to say the least. I'm like, how do I say this kindly? It's not the
Yes.
most appropriate stuff.
Hmm.
But it is so difficult, and I get it. I
Yeah.
totally get it, because I my whole thing about this book is I've lived to tell. It's not like I just figured this out overnight. I would have loved to have written this book when I'm 25, but
Mm.
I'm practically 40, and I'm
Yeah.
putting it out now because it takes time, and the temptation is to see everything crumble. And I talk about this in a chapter I call Cathedral Ruins, to sit in like all of the dust and the rubble and just look around and be like, okay, what to do now? Where do I even go? Where do I reside? Where's my home? Like, what is happening here?
Yeah.
To just sit in that and to just give yourself some space to just be. In my book, for me, when I was going through that time, I called it, for me, coasting.
Mm.
And I just let myself theologically coast. I had no answers.
Yeah.
In fact, not only did I not have answers, I didn't have questions, Glenn. I was so, and it was at a really broken time in my life. I
Yeah.
had just divorced my ex-husband. We were married for several years, and they were unhappy. And
Mm.
he was a great guy, and I was a great girl. We were just a product of like an evangelical
Mm.
standard of
Yeah.
marriage, and I know a lot of people will understand that.
Hmm.
And it was just a really hard and dark time in my life, and people were like, what is going on? Like, this came out of nowhere, and like, what's happening with your Christianity? And it was so much hitting all up at once. And I just remember moving into this little studio apartment in St. Paul all by myself, and just saying to myself, I don't have a question. I don't have an answer.
Mm.
I don't know what I think about things. And I wasn't quick to say, okay, then I guess I'm just an atheist. And I also wasn't quick to play the game of like, all right, well, I'm just going to keep going to church and pretend like everything's okay. I just
Yeah.
coasted
Yeah.
for at least a few years. And then life has a way of working itself out and opening itself up to you. If you are living in a way that is true to yourself and you don't compromise your own sense of integrity.
Hmm.
A theologian that I really like, Schubert Ogden, he's essentially said that trying to define faith, he defines it as that life is worth the living of it. And for me, this is faith. Like, this
Hmm.
is it. is living in a way that says it's all worth it. Like your
Yeah.
story, everything you've been through, it matters. It's worth it. Keep
Yeah.
going,
Yeah.
coast, be kind to yourself, give yourself time. And I talk about, I talk at the end of the book about like, why the journey is valid and why the journey is honorable, even if there's never a destination, even
Yeah.
if we never arrive somewhere,
Yeah.
that why the journey in and of itself is just and important and noble. So I would just say
Yeah.
time, like don't fall into the temptation of trying to have it figured out. Or like I said just a moment ago, don't even fall into the temptation of being like, oh, well, here's my new question. Maybe you don't have one.
Yeah.
I didn't for a
That's
long
right.
time. And that's okay.
Yeah,
So
that's really good because
yeah.
I had somebody a while back, maybe like a couple months ago, reach out and say like I'm in this place where I'm feeling this pressure to reconstruct. So I feel like that's like the
Mhm.
thing that so
Mhm.
many, I don't want to call them the gatekeepers, but like all the people
Yeah.
are kind of
Yeah.
positioning themselves as like the leaders in this kind of movement. Like you can't
Mhm.
just deconstruct or there's nothing left. You have to reconstruct and you have to start looking for better answers and things like that. And I said to the person like, I'm no I'm just on my own journey. I said, but like
Mhm.
from what I found, because I used to be in that spot too, but from what I found, like sometimes you just have to sit in the rubble and like
Mm.
let things around you be smoking and on fire and just get to the point where like you just sit there. I mean, you don't have to feel your journey is not somebody else's journey. Their journey is not your
Mhm.
journey. Your journey is your journey.
Yeah.
And for you, the peak might not be the destination. It might just be taking that next step, whatever that next step is going to
Yeah.
be for you. And it might not involve more questions or more answers or more Bible or less Bible, more Jesus, less Jesus. It might just be just sitting there and just grieving what's been lost and, letting yourself kind of come to be in the midst of all of that rubble. And I was like, I don't know if that makes any sense to this person. I said, but that's the only advice I have is just to be you and just to not feel like you have to obey all the other voices coming in at you.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. You mentioned that you were reading Mark earlier.
Mhm.
I love Mark. Mark is, out of the four gospels and out of the three synoptics is the
Mhm.
one that I was trained most in my early seminary days. And the end of Mark, the oldest manuscript we have of Mark only has that short ending,
Right.
which
Very abrupt.
essentially, yeah, very abrupt, which essentially basically says, um, and they were afraid,
Yeah.
the women who had gone to the tomb and they didn't see Jesus's body,
Yeah.
they didn't see Jesus laying there and they were afraid, and it
Yeah.
ends.
That's it.
Um, and I love that
Yeah.
because well, for two reasons. I love it because it invites the reader in to continue on that unfinished story.
Mhm.
But two, if the story were to just end there, like if there isn't a better example of like the ending points of life sometimes, I don't mean like actual physical
Sure.
life and death,
Sure.
but you know, when something leaves us very abruptly and very unceremoniously, sometimes there isn't a good ending or a happy one
Yeah.
or one that even makes sense.
Yeah.
Sometimes the story is completely unfinished and it always will be.
Yeah.
Um, but we have very little imagination for that sort of thing because we love knowing and we love the certainty and the comfort of that.
Yeah.
And there's no shame or blame in that. I mean, that is totally normal. Like
Mhm.
essentially we're going against the norm and we're subverting the norm by asking people to, you know, how you just said, sit
Yeah.
in the sackcloth and ashes and
Yeah.
watch the embers just
Smoking rubble.
flicker.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Wow. Well, Maria, we are just about out of time, but this has
Okay.
been a lot of fun. Thank you for taking the time to join me and talk about this book. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks, Glenn. I loved our conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and real quick, is there anywhere that people can go online to connect with you and your work, any website, social media you want to direct us to?
Yeah, absolutely. People can go to mariafrancescafrench.com and any social media, my Patreon. You can interact with me in a variety of ways. I do a lot of theological coaching as well. So having these kinds of conversations on a one-on-one, I'm available for that through my Patreon. But yeah, books, places I've published where you could read me, where you could find me, Instagram, Facebook, all of that. It's all on mariafrancescafrench.com. So
Great. I'll put it in the show
yeah,
notes and we'll do it again soon.
perfect. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you.